Case 1. Nancy Crampton Brophy. Sometimes the stories we write reveal more about us than we ever intended. Nancy Crampton Brophy seemed to have found her calling as a romance novelist. For years, she crafted tales of passion, betrayal, and dark twists that kept readers turning pages late into the night. Her books carried titles like The Wrong Lover and The Wrong Husband. Stories where characters navigated dangerous relationships and deadly secrets. But Nancy's greatest work of fiction wasn't published in any book. It was the life she presented to the world, a carefully constructed narrative that would ultimately unravel in the most devastating way imaginable. In Portland, Nancy and her husband, Daniel Brophy, appeared to be living a comfortable existence. Daniel worked as a beloved chef instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute, where students admired his expertise and warm personality. He'd spent years perfecting his craft, teaching aspiring chefs how to create magnificent dishes while sharing his infectious passion for food. At home, he tended a garden, raised chickens and turkeys, and prepared elaborate meals for Nancy. Friends knew them as a devoted couple who enjoyed sailing and working on jigsaw puzzles together. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, they seemed inseparable. Nancy portrayed herself as his biggest supporter. On her author website, she wrote fondly about being married to a chef whose life philosophy treated everything as an experiment. She posted about their backyard full of animals and the nightly feasts Daniel prepared. But beneath that carefully curated image, financial pressures were mounting. Nancy's self-published novels weren't generating significant income, and the couple had drained their retirement accounts years earlier just to stay afloat. Bills accumulated faster than they could manage them, and creditors weren't going away. Then came the morning of June 2nd, 2018. Daniel arrived at the Oregon Culinary Institute around 7:20 in the morning, alone in the building, as he prepared for his students. He disabled the alarm system and began setting up for the day's lessons, filling buckets with ice and water. Somewhere during those quiet moments, everything changed. When students began arriving for class, they discovered their instructor on the kitchen floor, fatally wounded. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery. Daniel's wallet, cash, and credit cards remained with him. The scene made no sense. The investigation moved slowly at first. Police canvassed the neighborhood, reviewed surveillance footage, and interviewed everyone connected to the culinary school. Traffic cameras revealed something peculiar. Footage of a minivan matching Nancy's vehicle traveling through downtown Portland during the exact time frame when Daniel was alone in that building. When detectives asked Nancy about her whereabouts that morning, she insisted she'd been home the entire time, completely unaware of any trip downtown. She claimed to have no memory whatsoever of driving anywhere near the institute. As investigators dug deeper, the financial picture became impossible to ignore. Nancy stood to receive over $1 million from multiple life insurance policies taken out on Daniel. There were workers' compensation benefits, accidental death provisions, and various other policies that would suddenly transform her desperate financial situation. Prosecutors would later argue that with Daniel alive, Nancy faced a life of continued hardship. With him gone, she'd be financially liberated. The evidence continued mounting. Detectives discovered Nancy had purchased gun components online months before the incident, specifically a Glock barrel from an internet marketplace. The purchase history suggested careful planning, acquiring parts separately to avoid creating obvious patterns. Though the actual weapon was never recovered, ballistics experts identified shell casings at the scene that matched the type of firearm she'd researched. Prosecutors theorized she'd swapped barrels to prevent forensic matching, then disposed of the crucial evidence. Then there was the essay. Years before Daniel's passing, Nancy had written a piece titled "How to Murder Your Husband" for a writing website. The document detailed various methods for committing an untraceable act, discussed motives ranging from financial gain to infidelity, and explored ways to avoid detection. She'd examined everything from weapon selection to the challenges of disposing of evidence. The judge ultimately excluded the essay from trial testimony, ruling it was too prejudicial and had been written too long ago. But its existence cast an undeniable shadow over the proceedings. Nancy's arrest came in September 2018, several months after that June morning. She pleaded not guilty, and her defense team constructed a narrative of coincidence and misunderstanding. They argued Nancy loved her husband deeply, pointing to romantic getaways they'd taken in the months before his passing and their plans for a summer vacation to Mount Rushmore. The gun parts, her attorneys claimed, were merely research materials for her novels. The downtown trip she couldn't remember. A psychological response to trauma, a form of retrograde amnesia triggered by learning of Daniel's fate. The trial stretched across 7 weeks in early 2022, with both sides presenting sharply contrasting versions of reality. Prosecutors hammered on the financial motive, the suspicious timing of her vehicle near the crime scene, and the fact that she'd lied about being home that morning. They brought forward witnesses who testified about the couple's mounting debts and Nancy's growing frustration with their circumstances. The defense countered by emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the evidence, insisting that the state's case relied on speculation rather than concrete proof. Daniel's stepson took the stand, describing a man who'd been an affectionate grandfather with a dry sense of humor. He testified about what appeared to be a solid marriage, noting he'd never heard his father express concerns about their relationship or finances. Hearing his testimony made the loss even more palpable, not just of a husband, but of a father figure whose absence would echo through generations. On May 25, 2022, after deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Nancy showed no visible reaction as the decision was read aloud in that Multnomah County courtroom. 3 weeks later, she appeared before the judge for sentencing. Family members delivered impact statements, expressing the magnitude of pain her actions had caused. Daniel's son addressed her directly, saying the theft of a parent and grandfather for such selfish reasons was unforgivable. The judge sentenced Nancy Crampton Brophy to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At 71 years old, she would spend what remained of her life behind bars, paying the price for transforming her fictional expertise in planning the perfect crime into a devastating reality. The romance novelist who'd built a career crafting stories about wrong lovers and wrong husbands had ultimately written her own tragic ending. One where the protagonist doesn't escape consequences, where justice catches up with clever schemes, and where the final chapter is written not by her imagination, but by a jury of her peers. But this story from Portland was just one dark chapter in Oregon's criminal history, and violence would strike again in an even more shocking public display. Case 2. Jeremy Joseph Christian. Hatred doesn't announce itself with warning signs until suddenly it's too late to stop what comes next. May 26, 2017, started as an ordinary Friday afternoon for commuters boarding Portland's Max Light Rail Green Line. The train car was crowded, but not uncomfortably so, with seats filled and some passengers standing as the train moved through northeast Portland along Interstate 84. Nobody could have predicted that within minutes, an ordinary commute would transform into one of the city's darkest moments. A violent eruption of hate that would leave 2 heroes lifeless and a community forever changed. Jeremy Joseph Christian stood out immediately when he boarded. At 35 years old, over 6 feet tall, and weighing 250 pounds, his presence commanded attention. But it wasn't his physical size that alarmed fellow passengers. It was the venomous rhetoric pouring from his mouth. He began shouting obscenities, hurling bigoted slurs and directing his fury toward two teenage girls who were simply trying to get home. One girl, 16-year-old Destiny Mangum, sat with her friend who wore a hijab. To Christian, their mere existence seemed to trigger something volcanic. The tirade escalated rapidly. Christian screamed that the girls should leave the country, insisted they had no place in America, and told them to go back to Saudi Arabia. He yelled that they weren't paying taxes and didn't belong. The verbal assault was relentless, filled with hatred toward their religion, their ethnicity, their very being. Witnesses later described the scene as terrifying. A large man, unhinged and aggressive. His anger directed at children who'd done nothing except exist in a space he felt entitled to dominate. Destiny and her friend tried to move away, retreating to the back of the train car. But Christian's rampage continued. The train operator's voice came over the loudspeaker, demanding that whoever was creating the disturbance exit immediately. Other passengers sat frozen, uncertain how to respond to the escalating chaos. Some pulled out phones, trying to document what was happening. Others simply looked away, hoping the situation would resolve itself without further confrontation. Then three men made a choice that would define them as heroes. Taliesin Mirdin, Namkai Meche, a 23-year-old recent college graduate, approached Christian and attempted to de-escalate the situation. Ricky John Best, a 53-year-old Army veteran and father of four, moved forward as well, positioning himself as a barrier between Christian and the frightened teenagers. 21-year-old Micah David Cole Fletcher, a Portland State University student, also stepped in, trying to calm the volatile situation. These three strangers, with no connection to each other before that moment, all recognized the same moral imperative. Vulnerable people needed protection, and staying silent wasn't an option. Christian's response was instantaneous and brutal. Within 11 seconds, he pulled a folding knife with a nearly 4-inch blade and struck all three men. The attack was swift, vicious, and overwhelming. Passengers screamed as the train pulled into the Hollywood Transit Center station. The girls fled, leaving their belongings behind in their terror. Other riders scattered, some rushing to help the wounded, while others called emergency services. Ricky Best collapsed at the scene, his injuries too severe to overcome. Paramedics arrived quickly, but couldn't save him. Taliesin Namkai Meche was rushed to a local hospital where medical teams fought desperately to preserve his life, but he too succumbed to his wounds. According to witnesses, Taliesin's final words were a message of love, asking someone to tell everyone on that train that he loved them. Micah Fletcher survived, though his wounds were serious and the psychological scars would prove even more enduring. Christian fled the train but didn't get far. Police located him on an access road near Providence Portland Medical Center, just east of the transit center. When officers surrounded him at 4:48 that afternoon, Christian threw the knife he'd used in the attack. It struck a patrol car and bounced away. During his arrest, officers heard him making statements that revealed zero remorse. Instead, he seemed almost proud of what he'd done, framing his violence as some twisted form of patriotism. The investigation revealed this wasn't Christian's first violent outburst. Just one day before the fatal attack, on May 25th, he'd confronted a woman named Demetria Hester at the Interstate Rose Quarter Max station. He'd hurled racial slurs at her and thrown a bottle before she defended herself with mace. Police had questioned him after that incident but released him. Less than 24 hours later, he was attacking people on another train. Christian's background painted a disturbing portrait. He had a lengthy criminal record stretching back to 2002, when he'd committed an armed robbery, wearing a ski mask, wielding a firearm, and handcuffing a store owner to a pole before fleeing with cash and merchandise. He'd served prison time for that offense, spending much of it in solitary confinement. After his release, he'd violated probation terms repeatedly, cycling in and out of custody. His social media presence revealed extremist views, with posts celebrating violence and expressing admiration for individuals responsible for terrible acts of domestic terrorism. The trial began in January 2020, nearly 3 years after that May afternoon. Christian faced 12 charges total, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, assault charges, intimidation charges, based on the hate-filled nature of his actions, weapons violations, and charges related to his attack on Demetria Hester the previous day. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony from dozens of passengers, recordings of Christian's own statements, both during and after the attack, and the physical evidence recovered at the scene. Christian's defense attempted to argue self-defense, claiming he'd felt threatened when the men approached him. He testified that he believed they were about to physically assault him, that their positioning reminded him of confrontations he'd experienced in prison, and that he'd acted out of fear for his safety. The prosecution dismantled this narrative systematically, demonstrating that Christian had instigated the entire situation, that the men were attempting to protect vulnerable teenagers, and that his violent response was grossly disproportionate to any perceived threat. Micah Fletcher took the stand, describing how the attack had fundamentally altered his life. He spoke about developing alcohol dependency in the months following the incident, battling nightmares, experiencing severe anxiety in everyday situations. He testified about entering rooms and immediately scanning for potential threats, about grabbing his partner's arm when she used a butter knife on toast, because the sight of a blade triggered panic. Every aspect of his existence had been touched by those 11 seconds of violence. The jury deliberated and returned on February 21st, 2020, with verdicts on all 12 counts. Guilty, every single charge. Christian showed no remorse during the verdict reading, maintaining the defiant posture he'd displayed throughout the proceedings. When Demetria Hester testified about her attack, Christian yelled obscenities at her from his seat, requiring removal from the courtroom. Sentencing came 4 months later, on June 24th, 2020. The families of Ricky Best and Taliesin Namkai Mesh delivered impact statements that brought the courtroom to tears. They spoke about fathers, sons, and friends who'd been stolen by senseless hatred. They described holidays that would never be the same, children growing up without their father, dreams cut short by violence. The prosecutor emphasized that Christian's crimes represented not just individual acts, but an attack on the community's core values of tolerance and mutual protection. Judge Cheryl Albrecht sentenced Jeremy Joseph Christian to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 310 months, nearly 26 years, to run on top of those sentences. Christian would spend the rest of his life in prison, with absolutely no chance of release. Even as he was led away, he continued his hateful rhetoric, showing the same contempt for human dignity that had characterized his actions on that train. The Portland community responded to the tragedy by honoring the 3 men who'd intervened. Memorials were erected, scholarships established in their names, and annual remembrances held to ensure their courage would never be forgotten. Ricky Best and Taliesin Namkai Meche became symbols of ordinary people making extraordinary choices when confronted with evil. A reminder that heroes aren't mythical figures, but everyday individuals who decide that standing up matters more than staying safe. Yet even as Portland mourned these losses, another devastating family tragedy from Oregon's past continued to haunt those seeking